Dear ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here, and sorry, I think we're running a bit late, but thank you for your patience. My name is István Kés, I'm the Executive Director of Danube Institute. I'm jumping in instead of our President, John O'Sullivan, who sadly has a nasty cold, so he couldn't make it. I hope you will manage with me as well. So thank you again for being here, at this early hour, and also at this preliminary conference, which is, I think it's safe to say it's mostly for our own researchers. I mean, of course, we are very grateful that we have some distinguished guests here, especially in the morning, but our original concept was that our own researchers will talk about their research topics and their ideas for this research. I think it's really important that we are here today because Christian persecution is a very interesting and very important topic, which sadly I still think doesn't really get enough coverage in our own media. I'm not talking mostly about Hungary because I think in Hungary it's an important topic. We have a state ministry which is dealing with persecuted Christianity and also with our own program for persecuted Christians. But I will still say that mostly in Western Europe and in America, the persecution of Christians is still muchly underdeveloped and not really talked about topic. And this is strange because if you look at all the research done on this area, you can see that today actually Christianity is the most persecuted religion in the world. For example, if you look at the World Watch List put together by Open Doors Foundation, I think you will talk about that a bit more, David, in the coming speech. You can see that attacks against Christians have been increasing, and not just in the past 10 years, but even in the previous year. Despite COVID, you have more and more Christians who are being persecuted because of their religion. So if you look at the latest statistics compiled by Open Doors, you can see that there are over 360 million people who have endured some forms of persecution last year. This basically is 1 out of every 7 Christian in the world. It's a huge number. Of course, not all of these people are being physically abused. A lot of these persecutions are more subtle. But still, it's a huge amount of people. And also, if you look at the physical attacks, there's also been a radical increase. So, for example, 5,898 Christians were killed last year, which is almost a 24% rise to the previous year. This is a huge number. And also, if you look at church attacks, there's been an almost 14% raise in that. Christians who have been arrested without trial is up by 44%. And those who have been kidnapped is up by 120%, a bit more than 120%. So these are really serious numbers, and it shows that we are talking about a very serious and very important issue of our time, which I still think is under-researched. And that is why we are here today. We wanted to, based on our previous research, which was basically about anti-Semitism in Hungary and its perceptions, we were thinking that we should look at other religions as well. And because Christianity is the most persecuted religion, it would make sense to start with this religion. And of course, we're hoping to involve other religions as well. I'm happy to see some friendly faces from Trends think tank from Abu Dhabi, who we met in January, and who we are hoping to involve more in the research, especially looking at Islamophobia in the future. So, because we're running a bit short in time, and I was asked in the last minute to give this speech. I don't really want to take away much of your time. I would like to introduce our 2 keynote speakers. First, we will have David Curry, who is, of course, the CEO of Open Doors since 2013. I think you're doing a really important work, David, at your institution. Perhaps you're the most important institution and think tank who is dealing with Christian persecution today. And in this role, you have traveled extensively in these countries, so you have a lot of personal experience with this. So thank you for being here. And another speaker is going to be Janine Di Giovanni, who is, of course, a very distinguished multi-award-winning journalist and author, and also a senior fellow and professor at Yale University's Jackson Institute for Global Affairs. I could go on extensively about your experience in the Middle East, but I think it will take away half of our time to go through all the countries you have been, from Palestine to Syria to Somalia and all the others. So thank you for being here as well. And I would like to give the floor to David Curry first, and when you're finished, I will kindly ask Janine to step in as well. Thank you again.
Well, thank you for that warm welcome. It's a pleasure to be here. I came from Los Angeles, and I brought the sunshine with me, so you can thank me for that. That's all my doing. I do want to talk about persecution today, and I think I'll talk for a few minutes, and I could certainly take questions either after my speech or whenever it's appropriate after Janine's, however you all would like to do it. Happy to take questions. Let me talk a little bit about Open Doors and what we are, how we began, because it will help you to understand our research. This morning, I want to talk a little bit about some of the trends that we see around the world when you're talking about the persecution of Christians and Christian communities. Open Doors began in the former Soviet Union. It began with a man who took the password, he took the code name of Brother Andrew. Some of you may know this story, but he was a Dutchman, and he felt very strongly that people behind the Iron Curtain should have access to Bibles. And so he began to, just on his own, he got a little VW Bug, he filled it with Bibles, and he started to drive across the border into the Soviet Union. And then it began not just a VW Bug full of Bibles, but then truckloads full of Bibles. And then he began to build the infrastructure that we know of today as Open Doors. And while we began in the former Soviet Union, we then moved to China and to the Middle East, and now we're in all the countries around the world which have a massive level of persecution of Christians. And our specialty really is as it was back then, back when we began, which is how do we stand with persecuted Christians wherever they may be. And Brother Andrew is still alive. He lives in the Netherlands. He's quite old now, but his idea, that initial idea that we stand with persecuted Christians, not for its political value, but for issues of faith, that the scriptures tell us that we are to stand with those who are persecuted for the name of Jesus, for those who are in prison for the name of Jesus, as if it were our own family or as if it were ourselves. So really for us, for me in particular, this is a spiritual transformational idea. I was a young man who had all sorts of issues. I still have a bunch of issues, but when I came to faith in Jesus, and when that happened, it changed my whole life for the better. And really what I want is for people to have the ability to have that same experience if they so choose. This idea that Christian faith is not just a political movement. It's not a political movement, but it is a spiritual transformation. It's the concepts, the words, the life, the lessons of Jesus is seen in the persecuted church. It's one of the things that I take so much hope from when we talk about all the difficult numbers here today, all the difficult trends. One thing you should know is that when Jesus' name is lifted up, people's lives are transformed. I met with a man named Pastor Muhammad. Now, Pastor Muhammad was a Muslim, from a Muslim background. He had experienced and accepted Jesus and the Christian faith on a personal level, but he lives in Libya. And Libya is a country, as you know, that has been torn apart for generations with Muammar Gaddafi, creating a system that was literally eating its own, where he would have the smartest children in school pulled out of school so that nobody within that culture was smart enough would grow up smart enough to challenge him. It was this idea of dictatorship in this really horrible manner in which he ruled. And Christians were persecuted in that society and still are today, even though you have 3 different governments that want to be recognized in Libya. The one thing they all sort of agree on, whether it's tribal government or the Muslim extremist government, is that Christians are not welcome. And Pastor Muhammad works in that area, supporting, standing with persecuted Christians. Now, you'd think he would be a depressing, very nervous guy. And that's what I expected when I traveled to North Africa just a couple of years ago before COVID to meet with him. When I go to North Africa, I tell you, I don't blend in, okay? So I stand out. And of course, people have a habit of following me around when I'm in these areas. I'm going to go to Ethiopia and some other countries here when I'm finished in Budapest. But as I was going to meet with Pastor Muhammad, I was a little nervous, like they're just going to follow me, get him, and capture him, and he'll be in trouble. So we go through this process at Open Doors where I guess you call it almost like a dry cleaning, where you go in one door of a restaurant, out the back. You sort of make sure that nobody's following you. And we just walked around and around and around this city in North Africa until finally we were clear that nobody was following me, and so that I could meet with Pastor Muhammad. And when I got through this process, as you go through it, about 35 minutes of trying to lose somebody tracking you, you're nervous yourself. I was uptight. I was nervous. I was, just stressed. And I expected Pastor Muhammad, who was actually the one in danger, to be even more so. But when I got there, this is what I want you to know. This is a person so full of faith. He just had a big smile on his face. He wanted to sing together. We just spent hours just talking about Jesus, what he was learning from Scripture and what was going on in his world. People like that are an inspiration, whose faith is so vibrant in the midst of persecution that it just makes you happy to know them. I suppose if I had one thing I wanted to say today, it would be this, that I want everybody to be free to read the Bible, to think for themselves on that Bible, to discuss it, and to talk about Jesus, the words of Jesus, the life of Jesus, and for them to be able to decide for themselves what to do with it. Now, that seems like a pretty common sense idea, but unfortunately, it's not very common. It's becoming less so anyway. So today, as I talk through some of these trends, I hope you'll study and think on and consider the life and the power of the words of Jesus. And I think if we all did that, it'd probably be a lot more peaceful world. And I think we could use a little of that. So let me talk about 3 or 4 trends here today, and then I'll take questions on any subject you'd like regarding the research. Open Doors is in all of these countries around the world that we research, about 75, 80 countries, where we research the incidents, the conditions under which Christians are persecuted for their faith, and then we measure it across a number of ways. What's it like to be a Christian in your family, within the government structure, within your personal life? Is it a level of violence, or is there a level of squeeze, sort of that smash and the squeeze? There are some countries around the world where there is no violence against Christians, but there's this squeezing of it. The pressure in every way of life. And we could talk about any of those sorts of things as we go on. But the first trend we saw this year, when we look at all the countries where Christians live and exist, is a trend towards what I call tribal extremism. This idea that whether it be Hindu extremists or Islamic extremists, it doesn't represent all of these religions, but the extremists within them. It's very tribal. It's becoming more so. And this tribal extremism is driving forward persecution. Now, the World Watch List is available to you. You can download it. You can download all of the research, all of the numbers, all of that is available to you. But what you will find is that there are many, many countries, the majority of the countries in the top 50 are driven by tribal extremism. In Afghanistan, is now number 1 on our world watch list after 20 years. And the reason why is because you have tribes of extremists within that country. The Taliban owned and controlled 70% of that country, even before the fall of the civilization in September and August of this past a few months ago. What happened there was they within the areas in which they controlled it, they imposed a religious infrastructure, of the most extremist kind of Islamic infrastructure on these Afghan territories. So we knew what they were going to do because they had been doing it. Last week they announced, no, they're not going to let women go to school. And some people acted surprised, but they've been doing this all along and imposing pressure on people who don't share their extremist views, moderate Islam, Muslims, or certainly Christians. They were given a list of influential Christians, and they instantly, within hours of getting this list, began to try to find those people, track them down, and uncover the network, underground network within Afghanistan. That's why it's number 1 on the world watch list today. But it's indicative of this kind of tribal extremist worldview that's driving forward persecution of Christians. It's not just in the Islamic world. India, surprisingly, it always surprises me, despite the fact I know all of the infrastructure and the reasons within it, is number 10 on our world watch list. Why is that? Because they have a nationalistic Hindu party that runs that country, who since 2014 has been stoking this violence against Christians and religious minorities. You have right now today 27 pastors that we've been trying to publicize this, who are under a death threat because their village, their region, has decided that these people are problems, that because they're Christians, because they talk about their faith, they're living their faith, that these pastors need to be eliminated. This is being discussed on social media. Pastor Yalaran Shankar was killed on March 18th. He's the first of these 27 who have been killed. Now the other 26 are in hiding. This is going on all over India. When it was mentioned that there's a rise in detention of pastors statistically without trial, much of that is within India, where these local municipalities arrest the pastor if they're finding a small group, and they threaten them and hold them for weeks and months at a time. So tribal extremism is one trend. The second trend I want to highlight is what I call this rise of centralized government control. Now, that's always been an issue around religious freedom or freedom of any kind. And it's typically on our list been indicated first and foremost by countries like North Korea, which had this post-communist post-Soviet system, communist government, mixed with a religion built around its leaders. And you had this very toxic mix, all coordinated centrally from the government. But you might say sort of in a primitive, old school fashion. They had neighborhood watches where people would get more food or another chicken. Of course, with so much hunger and starvation there, that means a lot. That children would be bribed with food. If anybody in the neighborhood or the kids would see somebody or know anybody who has a Bible in that country, those people would be arrested and put into prison camp. This kind of centralized government control was always sort of seen through that view, strong authoritarian government. It's not changed there just because it's number 2. Recently, there was a raid just days ago where they found a small group of Christians who were meeting and studying the Bible. Now, typically, Christians in North Korea meet in groups of 2 or 3. This was a slightly bigger group. That entire group was raided, and those Christians were executed. They then went to the homes of those people and arrested 100 others who are now in labor camps. We estimate that there is upwards almost 80,000 Christians in labor camps in North Korea today. So centralized government control has always been a factor in our research, but it's growing more so. And I think that the scariest interpretation of this is number 17, China. And that is because it has this technological blueprint. It's using facial recognition and centralized database, a social scoring system where it says, you're not a great citizen if you go to church too often or if you go to church at all. And they now have the ability to sort all of this data together and say, that we're going to make sure that if you're a Christian, you don't travel, you don't fly, you might lose a job, your kids don't go to university. And there's this chilling, what I call this high-tech noose, which is getting tighter and tighter and tighter around Christians in China. And I think it's very significant because China wants to sell this technology to other countries as well. They're now, trying to choke out all of these cryptocurrencies as well and create one government-controlled cryptocurrency, which would be another piece of that puzzle. So that if you're a follower of Jesus or if you're a Uyghur Muslim, you're not allowed to practice your faith and have your money in the Chinese bank. It will certainly happen. So centralized government control is the second trend we see. The third one is that Christian women are the most persecuted people in the world today. Now, how is that possible? Well, there's 360 million Christians who live in areas of severe or high persecution right now. So, wow, that's a huge number. How is that possible? Well, there's 100 million Christians in China. All of them now are being monitored at one level, and churches are being fractured out. So when you start to think about the numbers of Christians in China, the numbers of Christians in Africa who are living, it's not hard to get to that number. And the most persecuted of those, the most vulnerable of those are Christian women. And that's why we say that Christian women are the most persecuted people in the world today. On March 7th, a woman named Majid is in Erbil. She had posted on social media, she comes from a Muslim family. She had posted on social media that she had made a personal decision. She had read the Bible, had some discussions about Jesus, decided she wanted to be a follower of Jesus. And she posted that on social media, and her family, one of her uncles, killed her for it. This honor killing in Erbil. This is all too common. Forced marriages, sexual violence against Christian women in order to try to either shame the pastors or to shame these families. It's just too much. There's a friend that I have in Pakistan. Her name is Hannah, and she lives in this constant terror, and she shares with our researchers regularly all that's going on in that part of the world and throughout the Gulf. And it's too common that Christian women are targeted, and that's a trend that we see that jumps out of our research. The last trend I want to mention is that Africa, in our view, based on the statistics, is becoming the epicenter of jihadi violence. Now, how can I say that with all that's gone on in Syria and Iraq? Well, you have Nigeria, which has Boko Haram, an extremist group. You have Fulani militants, which also have an extremist ideology. And those two have started in Nigeria and across that middle belt of the African continent, the Sahel region of that continent. The violence has been spreading out for over a decade, and it's becoming really the epicenter of jihadi violence. When we saw Iraq and Syria spinning out of control with ISIS, we immediately began to see patterns of bomb makers, money flowing into this region, and it has continued. It's fractured. There are lots of groups, but it is now spreading, much like what was happening in Iraq when we saw bombings on Christmas and leading up to in some of the holy days, and then all of a sudden ISIS in the summer, in June and July, tipped over into this regional caliphate. That's happening in Nigeria. It's the north of Nigeria. It's now into Chad. It's into Burkina Faso, which wasn't even on our top 50 list. And now I forget where it's at, but it's moved up into the 30s, I believe, because of this violence, an entire region. Now, why is that the case? Why would that be such a vulnerable area? Well, there's a really toxic mix of things going on there. You have governments which have great corruption, which creates all kinds of problems. So you then have young populations, young men who have no chance at having a sustainable lifestyle, or at least that's the way they see it. And then you have all this poverty, and then you have illiteracy, and you have a toxic brew of extremism. And we think that set of circumstances, along with these very, very extremist groups in the north and large Christian populations in the south, and we think you're going to see more violence in this region in the years to come. When you begin to see these trends, what you're really seeing is the drivers behind persecution. And until those things are resolved, you're not going to see things get better, I'm afraid. So I go back to what I said originally, which is I really simply want people to have the freedom to read a Bible, to decide for themselves what they think about it, to discuss it, and choose for themselves what they believe. That everybody should have this right of conscience, the freedom of conscience, the ability to make up your own mind what you believe. It's so simple, isn't it? But unfortunately, it's so rare now. There are religions around the world which have what I call the Hotel California mindset. If you remember that song for the Eagles way back? You can check out anytime you want. You just can never leave. People born into faith that they can never leave. They can't change their registration. They can't change their mind. They can't decide what they think. It's not right. It's not human. So share this story. Share these trends. Let's discuss it. And I think when we begin to grow this discussion, you're going to see a lot of people around the world, whether they be Muslim, Christian, Jew, or atheist, people will begin to see this is a fundamental human right, the right of conscience, and it should be afforded to Christians all over the world. Thank you so much for having me here, and I could certainly take questions, or however you'd like to do it. Great, thank you. Please welcome Janine.
Thank you so much for that. It's really interesting. And thank you for having me here in this beautiful place. It's great to be in Budapest, where I haven't been for a very long time. So I'm going to talk very informally about my work, but about my last book, which was called The Vanishing, The Twilight of Christianity in the Middle East. I was thinking back about how the book started, and it really started on June 10th, 2014. When I woke up in my hotel room in Baghdad, turned on the BBC radio, and learned that Mosul had fallen to the Islamic State. We knew that was coming because ISIS had actually begun to take Mosul 6 days before. But the speed at which Mosul fell was absolutely stunning. And the immediate aftermath of the clearing of people who took to the roads to head wherever they could to safety, largely toward the Nineveh plain in the north, was absolutely terrifying. Baghdad isn't so far by road from Mosul, and actually people in Baghdad began to panic. And the first thing I did, I was staying in a Christian hotel, actually, because I'd always found that it was the safest place. In those days, Baghdad was violent. There were car bombs, but more importantly, there was kidnapping. And this Christian hotel was renowned to be a place where you could be protected. But that morning when I went down to get coffee, there was complete chaos. I've never seen anything like it. People were packing, people were fleeing, people were running one way or the other, trying to get back to their families. And I drove to the house of a Chaldean bishop who was a friend of mine. And he answered the door. He was extremely busy, but I sat down, he gave me a coffee, and he was basically working the telephones, trying to reach Mosul, trying to reach people in Marrakesh, in other cities and villages which were about to become engulfed by ISIS. And people were saying to him, what should we do? Should we leave? We have relatives in America, in Canada. Should we just get plane tickets and go? And he was absolutely tortured because he didn't know what to say. On one hand, if it was him, if it was his family, of course he would say, leave, take your possessions, go as quickly as you can. But if he did that, he knew what the Christians of Iraq were facing. The greatest threat to them is migration. And their communities were already disappearing. And with the Islamic State, it would mean that they would shrink into nothingness. So when we finally had time to talk, his anguish as a spiritual leader was so profound. And basically, he said to me, these are our last days in this ancient land, the land where we've been since the 2nd century. Over the next 2 years, as all of you know, Daesh, the Islamic State, wreaked complete havoc and terror and fear, and their tenet was cruelty. I've witnessed cruelty, torture, ethnic cleansing, sexual violence during wartime for 3 decades, but ISIS took it to a different level. And their target was anyone who was not a devout follower of their Salafist way of Islam. So it was also Muslims who weren't pious, but it was mainly Christians and Yazidis. Yazidis, as many of you know, are semi-indigenous people in the region of northern Iraq, Kurdistan. They speak a different language than the Kurds and the Arabs. They were hugely persecuted under Saddam Hussein. They live very self-contained lives. I've been lucky enough to spend time with them in their villages and go to their funerals, their weddings. They're very welcoming people, very closed, though, because they've been persecuted for so long. The Yazidis and the Christians were the first on ISIS's hit list, basically. So when they went through Mosul, the first thing they did, and they were very systematic, they already had lists of people, Christian communities where they were living, is they gave them a choice. You can either stay, but you must convert. You can leave, or you pay an enormous tax, a jizya, which most of them never could afford to pay. So they would have to give up their factories, their farmlands, their animals, anything they had. So most of them fled. The ones who stayed had an N written above their door for Nazarene Christian. The people who stayed are amongst the bravest and most courageous people I've ever known, because ISIS were terrifying. As a journalist, ISIS wasn't really a surprise to my colleagues and I, because we knew I was working in Syria during the war. And I'd say as early as 2012, we started noticing checkpoints of different kinds of men who weren't necessarily Syrian, who were speaking other languages, who had long beards, short pants, and who were much more fierce and cruel than the Syrian guards that had been there before. And then they began kidnapping journalists. Many of my colleagues, a dozen, were kidnapped. 2 of my friends and colleagues were beheaded by the Islamic State, Steve Sutloff and Jim Foley. So it was a level of intention for them to take and to begin their caliphate. So working in those communities during that time and in the aftermath was really, really difficult, because here were very traumatized people. I know tomorrow I'm speaking to some of you about how to work in these kind of places and the methodology that you use when you try to interview or get information from extremely traumatized communities without re-traumatizing them again. It's very difficult. And some of these people, the stories of them leaving in the middle of the night, because people never want to leave their homes. Every time I hear someone, I lived in America during the Trump years, so I was especially sensitive to the plight of refugees and migrants crossing the southern border. And every time I heard someone say, why do they want to come here? Why can't they stay in their own country? Every single person I've ever interviewed in my 30 years working with refugees No one ever wants to go unless they're deathly afraid that they, their families, will be attacked, killed. So people often wait until the very last minute, and then they get the phone call in the middle of the night. And someone will say, ISIS are now in Marrakesh, you've got 1 hour to go. And one of the first questions I always ask people is, what do you take with you? And it's so interesting because in that final moment, when you have an hour to leave, to get in your car, you pack your documents, if you can find them, some money if you have it. Many people, especially in the Arab world, take gold because they know that it's something they can trade or they can use afterwards. Sadly, they leave their animals behind, and they try to get somewhere safe. So in Iraq, many of them went to this beautiful monastery, 3rd century monastery, which is built in a mountain above Erbil called Marmatai. And this monastery sheltered about 40 families throughout the worst of the ISIS time. And strangely, ISIS took I wish I had a map, but ISIS took all of the villages, which were kind of a string going from Mosul into the Nineveh plain, but they never got up to the monastery. And most of these people were Syrian Christians. There's a mix in Iraq, basically, it's a mix of Assyrians, Chaldeans, Orthodox, Eastern Christians, and they're not, which was surprising to me, they're not really united. There's often big debates between the Chaldeans and the Syrians, which are usually based on aid money. Anyway, the extraordinary thing about going back after ISIS finally fell in 2016 and the caliphate was dissolved was that the Christians were still there. Some of the women had been taken to Raqqa, which was ISIS's capital, along with many Yazidi women. They were sold on stages like this as sex slaves, also young boys. I once, and it was one of the most horrible things I've ever done, watched a live slave market. And I was doing it with a Yazidi man who was a local man who was a rescuer. And what he did, he was unbelievably courageous. I think he had been a plumber in his life before. But inside Raqqa, at that time, everything was so deeply controlled. And the women who were taken, of course, were the 2nd or 3rd or even 4th wives of the ISIS fighters. And like Bosnia and Rwanda as well, they were raped with the intention of making them pregnant so that there would be more ISIS fighters eventually. And this man organized for the door-to-door salesmen who were working in Raqqa, who would go and sell sponges or face cream or whatever women needed. He infiltrated them, and he got them to go to the doors and say, meet me at 3:00 at this road. But for the women to even get out of the house at 3:00, and remember, some of them had children already, was unbelievably dangerous. So what he was risking, getting them to these precise points and then getting them out of Raqqa and getting them back into Iraq, into Erbil or Dohuk. Dohuk was a big center of returning, I hate the word sex slaves, sexually abused women. That was where they would go. And then the aftermath of that, of trying to reintegrate them back into society, into very patriarchal societies and very strict societies where they would be shunned. The Yazidi faith-based leader, Sheikh Ismaili, who died 2 years ago, did something remarkable that I've never seen in any other place I've worked where there's been sexual violence during wartime. He basically said, we must embrace these women. We must take them back into the fold. They will not be shunned. And this was incredible because literally in Bosnia, in Kosovo, in Syria, in all these places, I've always worked with women and men who have been sexually violated during wartime. And usually what happens is they're absolutely shunned. I know fiancés that have left the women they were going to marry. I was just told about a man whose wife left him after he had been raped in prison. And generally these people are treated like pariahs. But the Yazidi leader basically said, no, we will embrace them, which was rather remarkable. So that is Iraq. Syrian Christians, I wrote 4 chapters in my book, basically. One on Syria, one on Iraq, one on Gaza, and one on Egypt. I didn't include Lebanon, and many people ask me why, and that's because there are so many Christians in Lebanon, nearly 32%, and they also are, in a sense, integrated into the political life, whereas the president of Lebanon always has to be a Christian. They have much more sway, much more power, and I think they're much more amalgamated into the culture, into society. They're not as vulnerable. Syrian Christians have an added dilemma of the geopolitics of the war, which is now in its 12th year, which is a horribly long time. It's a generation of a child growing from birth to nearly adolescence. So in 12 years, the Syrian society's been absolutely disrupted on every level: education, healthcare, family life. Cities like Aleppo, which once had been vibrant Christian communities, largely Armenian Christians, are now under government control. They've been wiped out. And the war, even though most of us don't hear about it now, especially with Ukraine, is still going on. Idlib is the last holdout. So Christians in Syria had a very unusual position, which actually in the Middle East is not that unusual, in that many of them supported Assad, Bashar al-Assad. In Iraq as well, and also in Egypt, I found that there was this, it's never really written about, and there's no theories that prove it, but that by and large Christians generally support dictators for protection. Saddam did protect Christians. Mubarak did protect Christians, and Assad, who is an Alawite, which is a heretical branch of Shiism, protected the Christians. So very difficult to ascertain whilst I was there in the midst of the war, whether they were saying this to me because they were frightened. Everyone in Syria is frightened because of the secret police, or whether generally Assad is their God. And that's the words they use. He is my God. Probably the most vulnerable Christians that I came across were those in Gaza. And I'd like to talk a little bit about Gaza in general, because while the Christians suffer, it's the entire population that's under extreme duress and has been for decades. I went back to Gaza. I'd been there before COVID, and then once it opened up, I went back last summer. And this was after the 11-day Israeli strike in May, which basically knocked out an already fragile infrastructure. So no clean water, completely sporadic electricity, sometimes 2 hours a day, sometimes not at all. Entire streets where entire, family groups, 30, 40 people at a time, had been killed during the bombing. Now, in these 2 million people who are packed into 7 miles by 14 miles of absolute misery, repression, suffering under the Israeli and the Egyptian siege, there are 800 Christians, which is kind of unfathomable. They're largely Greek Orthodox, although there's Catholics, there's evangelicals, there's some Lutherans, and they are besieged within a siege. Now, they were, interestingly enough for me, the most closed community to try to reach. And I spent a lot of time with them. I have spent a lot of time with them over the years. They're really frightened because on one hand, they're under Hamas, and the other hand, what they desperately want is to get to Bethlehem for their religious celebrations for Christmas and Easter. And they're at the mercy of the Israelis to give them exit permits to get there. And they can't. And this Christmas, the Israelis made a big show of saying, we gave 34 or more exit visas. But in fact, what they do is they'll take a family and say, okay, one person can go. So they don't want to be separated from their families at Christmas. No one goes. They're increasingly shrinking because largely unemployment rates. In Gaza, it's now 74%, and yet it's one of the most highly educated populations in the Middle East. Gazans are extremely well educated. One thing that is often said to me is they can close our bodies down by the siege, but they can never close our minds. So I find young Gazans the most resourceful, the most interesting, the most curious. They often speak 3 or 4 languages, which they learn on YouTube, sadly knowing they're probably never going to get to those places to practice those languages, but they persevere. They're absolutely remarkable people, and they're very forgotten. So Christians there, for me, I try to really focus on that and their lives and how they continue and how they also are caught again, which is really the dilemma that all Christians in the Middle East are. Do we leave and go to our relatives in Canada or America, which is where most of them want to go? And you might recall during Trump's Muslim ban in 2016, Arab Christians were not included in that. So they could still emigrate, but Muslims could not. Egypt, I found an entirely different situation. I found that they were discriminated but not persecuted. There are laws within the Egyptian constitution which forbid things like building new churches or holding very high-ranking army positions. But by and large, in Cairo, you could be a Copt, a Christian Copt, and live a life that was pretty unremarkable. You could basically do what you want. And I spent a lot of time trying to interview people, different age groups, different parts of the city, different backgrounds. And most of them, while they distinctly felt Christian, it was their primary identity, they did not feel that their lives had been impinged on. Going into Minya, which is in Upper Egypt, was absolutely an entirely different experience. I felt like I was going into the 5th century. There, Christians are burnt inside their churches. They're prohibited to go to Mass. The churches themselves, when I stayed in a small village and the church had been a shop front, and there was a huge, I've never seen such a big lock placed on it, so they couldn't go. And the local pastor had tried to hold masses under trees, secretly in bedrooms, wherever he could. If he was found out, if he was caught, he was arrested, he was beaten. It was extremely primitive. So the vast difference between the rural Christians, Copts in Egypt and the ones in Cairo and Alexandria and the cities was completely different. I kept going back and forth to Iraq the most, I think, because the effect of ISIS on society had been so absolutely enormous. And what really fascinated me in the aftermath, going to Marrakesh and places like that, where the churches, it's hard to explain how dramatic ISIS had destroyed these churches. They had gone in and with great hatred ripped down the crucifixes, tore down the pictures of the saints, trampled on them, slashed the faces, broke, if you could imagine breaking a chalice, but did everything they could to mangle it. The churches were, I'm imagining now walking through one and what it was like. And then the aftermath and seeing how people went back. They actually went back. Sometimes it would just be 1 or 2 families at first going back to these empty, eerie villages where there were just sheep, nothing else. They had destroyed the houses. And they still went, and they rebuilt the churches, and they began to have Mass again. They got a lot of help, of course, from Christians around the world, and eyes were on them. Less so, I mean, Iraq probably is the one place which managed to restore itself. Syrian Christians in Damascus or Aleppo especially, I don't think those who fled will ever go back. Many of them drove literally in the night. They went from Aleppo to Turkey and straight to Yerevan, where many of them had never been before because they were born and raised Armenian Christians in Aleppo. But I think it looks like the war in Syria is winding down. Unfortunately, Bashar al-Assad is being normalized by countries such as the UAE, who are welcoming him, accepting him. Idlib will eventually fall and the war will be over, and there will have to be a process of people beginning to heal, reconciliation, although I think it will take a long, long time. But Gaza is the place I worry about the most. And again, the big fear is emigration. The young Christians that I met who were really remarkable, they had no choice but to leave because there's no work. So I can take questions now, or I think, Jeffrey, you wanted us to wind up, and I'm very happy to talk about any of it. Thank you so much.
Thank you to both. That was very inspiring. Thank you. We have a few minutes for questions, and it's a wonderful opportunity to ask. Please. Do not be shy. Go ahead.
A question for David. Hello. Yeah, a question for David regarding India, because you mentioned India in your presentation. I was just wondering, because you had talked about Christian minorities in India and how they were being persecuted, but India paints itself as a democracy, and Christian minorities in India are most probably not really that significant in comparison to Hindus, Sikhs, and other Christian communities. So I was wondering what the state or the government is doing to address this particular issue. You would imagine that they would take some form of action. Thank you.
Does that work? Oh, there we go. Okay. Thank you. Yeah, India is number 10 on our watch list. The government is, in this case, the prime minister, the BJP party, it is the problem because they're stoking this unrest against Muslims and Christians within the community. So you have some parts of the country which are run by these governors within that party that are either overlooking or even encouraging mob violence. I mentioned social media when I was discussing this because it's not something that's hidden. The attackers are literally under this I say it's nationalism, and essentially it's could be summarized in the phrase, "You're not really an Indian citizen unless you're Hindu." That's what they believe. This sect, and they are encouraging these attacks against Christians. They're shut down any Christian and many of the NGOs within the area that would seek to help feed the poor, these kinds of things. Even Mother Teresa's mission has come under great legal issue there in India. So the BJP party and its agenda is part of what's driving this forward. But it is a democracy. There eventually parties come and parties go, leaders come and leaders go. But this idea is really, I think, an anathema to what at least we in America have always felt about India, which is peaceful, nonviolent, kind of an idea. So I hope that the future is bright. I think we need India to be an open society in a greater way, and to really call out this violence against Christians and Muslims for what it is, and stand up and clamp down on it. The government itself, denies that it's happening or says that it's just some bad actors, but I believe they're they're participating in.
Thank you. Other questions?
Hi, my question is also to David, if I might. I was wondering if you could say a few words, particularly about your project in Pakistan.
Did you say in Palestine?
Pakistan.
Yeah, there are Christian communities. If you have something specific, but I'll just talk about the environment there. It's number 8 on our watch list. There are some Christian communities that are grandfathered in there, but certainly there. I think there's a battle for the heart of this country. I think it could certainly be one of those countries, even though it's quite high on our list. There's strong group of extremists there. There's a lot of attacks, a lot of pressure against Christians. There are occasional bombings against Christian churches. There are lots of issues there, but I feel like it's one of these countries which could go the other way if some strong some civil rights and leadership gets into that country. So I am not totally pessimistic on Pakistan, but the reality is Christian women are persecuted there. Christians are targeted there. You can practice, if you're in the Anglican faith and others, you can practice your faith in church, but those churches are often attacked by extremists. So there's an underground current of extremism, which is very strong in Pakistan right now.
Please.
To Janine, my question is, I'm Peter Morvay from HETEC, journalist. You mentioned the elimination of ISIS that has happened, but we could see that only yesterday they have committed a terror attack in Israel, in the city of Hadera, with machine guns targeting Israeli civilians. So how far could they have been eliminated? And another thing is that you've mentioned the Christians living in Gaza, and don't they feel that they are more a victim of the Hamas, who are attacking Israeli civilians, shooting thousands of rockets on cities, that they are somehow captured? How do they feel about their oppressors? Do they feel more of the responsibility on Hamas than on Israelis? Thanks.
Does that work? Okay. So the occupation existed before Hamas and before Hamas were elected in Gaza. And the persecution of Palestinians, all Palestinians, Christian and Muslim within Gaza. They do fear Hamas, but Hamas also, and I am in no way justifying Hamas's violence, what is far more debilitating are the effect of the occupation on daily life and their inability to do anything, the yoke of oppression that is on them. That's both, I have to stress, Christians and Muslims, but the Christians are a minority within a minority, so for them it's even more difficult. But the life is absolutely punishing, collective punishment, and just the lack of hope. If you're a young person and you're highly educated, you've gone to, I keep thinking, I know so many dentists in Gaza, young people who trained at the university and became dentists. No chance of getting a job, no chance of getting out, no chance of even getting to Jerusalem to visit your relatives. So this kind of constant state of mental claustrophobia and physical claustrophobia is just extreme. And the first question was about ISIS, other groups that attack?
Yeah, I mean, ISIS, they are very much on the run. They committed a terror attack in Hadera. But if you just let me comment on what you've said, you mean occupation in Gaza? There is no Israeli occupation in Gaza. They have left.
There is a mental occupation. They may have left physically. The troops might have withdrawn in 2006, but there is no
physical occupation. They have left the Gaza Strip in 2005. Another thing is that terror existed before Hamas. It has been existed since the creation of the State of Israel. It's been an ongoing terror against the Israeli civilians. Thanks.
During the May bombing, 262 people died in Gaza. How many people died in Israel? There's an Iron Dome. The United States gives billions of dollars to protect Israel. There is a clear imbalance between what happens to Palestinians and what happens to Israeli citizens. I don't want to go down this road because we're here to talk about something else, but we could talk about it afterwards if you like. But I think there's absolutely the indignity of, and in the West Bank, the encroachment of land by settlers, government policy, and just the restriction of movement in Gaza. So I'll end on that one. The restriction of movement imposed by Israelis, forbidding them to leave, even for medical treatment, is still enormous and illegal and violates international law. So, sorry about that. In terms of Daesh, they are disbanded, but I actually think I think they are regrouping into different forms. And certainly for people in Iraq, Christians in Iraq, the fear now is more Iranian-backed groups, like in Marrakesh, where a lot of Iranian fighters had come in, or HTS or other jihadist groups that they fear. So, and as for ISIS, I think that they had one of the most brilliant campaigns, social media and recruitment, and I say this in a kind of ironic way because they were so horrible, but their recruitment techniques were remarkable. I don't know if you ever saw Dabiq, their magazine, the way they use social media, their guy in Saudi that coordinated the entire ring of it. I don't think they're finished. I just think they're regrouping under a different name, different tactics, but that they will come back.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Let me ask one final question of each of you. It's kind of where our project begins is where you continue. But in terms of media attention, you find that anti-Semitism draws a great deal of media attention, great number of resources for study. Islamophobia increasingly is becoming a hot button issue and has great coverage. Why do attacks on Christian communities and institutions get relatively little attention in the West? And I would ask each of you from your own perspective.
I think people don't know about it. It's really remarkable. In America, when I would speak to groups, Christian groups, they would say, we had no idea that this was happening. And during the height of ISIS, I think there was a lot of focus on Yazidis, which is interesting, and also understanding media. I think it comes down to journalism and media, right? So right now there are 5,000 journalists in Ukraine, 5,000. So the world's attention is on Ukraine, but there are other wars going on. The war in Syria is still going on, Ethiopia, terrible things going on all over the world, but we're not focused on that because journalism for this moment is focused on Ukraine. Now, when ISIS descended, TV cameras managed to get to Mount Sinjar, where the Yazidis were trying to flee, and they got extremely dramatic pictures. So that drew other reporters from all over the world. We've got to get to Mount Sinjar. And in a sense, the Christians weren't really reported very much at that time. And I think there's just a lack of knowledge about that this actually is happening, that it is a huge issue. I've been told over and over that within 100 years, there will be no more Christians in Iraq, that the numbers are plummeting so drastically that it will be 100 years. But about a month ago, I was on a call with the Archbishop of Canterbury's office and a few bishops from Lebanon and throughout the region. And when I said 100 years, he said, "You're wrong. You're being really optimistic. It's 40 years. So, I mean, that is a very dramatic situation. And I think in America, which is essentially the majority are Christians in America, it's not well known, especially amongst the evangelical community.
I also would add that I think there's some bad theology that Christians have adopted that suggests that Jesus said we're going to be persecuted, so therefore we must accept it and not speak out on it. But there's plenty of scriptures that you could counter with, some of which I referred to, where Scripture says we're supposed to. It's like a universal calling within Scripture that believers are to care for, pray for those who are injured, oppressed for the name of Jesus. In some sense, what we say at Open Doors is we don't assume that we can stop persecution from a theological sense, because Jesus said we'd be persecuted as he was persecuted. But we should be standing with each other. We should be speaking out. So I think there's some theology there that's problematic for Christians. I think the other thing is we're not a particularly sympathetic group. Now, I think I'm sympathetic, but we could argue that point. But I think secular intolerism has painted Christians as intolerant. That there probably, with some notable examples, that can be true in cases. And people perceive sharing their faith as proselytizing, and there's been some good PR around people saying, anti-conversion laws and proselytizing, when really we need to discuss that idea, because we're talking about Pakistan, the blasphemy laws. People aren't allowed to talk about their faith, but there's been positioned as though you're really the problem if you're sharing your faith, if you're talking about what you're going through. So I think that can be part of the challenge as well.
Okay.
Also, one more thing, that going back to the Muslim ban of 2016, Trump's Muslim ban, I found this incredibly damaging and dangerous on two levels, but the first one being that it set up a paradigm of good refugees and bad refugees. So good refugees being Christian, they could come, bad refugees being Muslim. And right now, I think there is another issue, which is, Ukrainian refugees, more than 2 million people have left, mainly women and children, who are being welcomed, which is, they should be. Everyone who flees a country or a war or political extremism should be welcomed. But there are also right now Afghan and Syrian refugees on the border of Bosnia in Bihać who are trying to get into Croatia, are turned back every night. They try again, over and over again. And on some level, I find this hypocrisy with the international community, especially when it comes to refugees and welcoming people who are trying to flee extreme situations. Because the Syrians, the Afghans, the migrants coming from Africa who are desperately fleeing regimes and poverty were turned back and were drowned and were not made to feel welcome. So this is something I think about a lot, actually.
Thank you, and thank you to both of our speakers. It was a very, very wonderful way to open the conference.